factors associated with migration. At the end of this lesson, you are going to be identifying whether or not a statement is a push statement or a pull statement. The first thing I'd like you to write down is the definition of overpopulation. Oftentimes, people will migrate into a place and create a problem of overpopulation. Overpopulation is defined when there are so many people that the environment cannot provide enough food, water, or shelter. If you'll recall, these are the three things necessary for survival. So overpopulation would be if we do not have enough food, water, or shelter to provide for the people that are living in an area. Also, due to overpopulation, the quality of life may begin to drop, again, because there's overcrowding, because there's too much competition for the resources. And then populations tend to collapse upon themselves, meaning that there's no longer stability within a civilization, and the population will find ways to either resolve the circumstances to move out of those areas, or the population could come up against itself, civil war, people fighting for those resources. Let's talk about some historic migrations, people on the move, things that have happened throughout history. Why do people move? So let's talk all the way back up in Bible times in regards to Abraham. If you will remember in Genesis 12, if you've ever studied the book of Genesis, the Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." And they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. This was one time when God actually commanded Abraham to leave the land of Ur and to head out for the land of Canaan. And this was, again, going to be a time when Abraham took his family and moved. Later on, God commands Abram to actually leave Canaan and go to Egypt. Now, there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. So we see in this latter area in Genesis 12:10, this latter example, where there was a push factor. Something pushed Abraham out of the land, and God actually told him to leave because there wasn't enough food to provide for them in Canaan, and Egypt had the food. Here is an example of Abraham's journey through the promised land, or to the promised land. And again, we have the city of Ur. If you know anything about geography and biblical geography, Ur is actually near modern day Baghdad in Iraq. This whole area here, these are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Babylon, again, in Iraq. So this area here is near where we see today modern day Iraq. This was the travel that Abraham took. And then the dotted line here is Canaan, which is the promised land of Israel. And then he leaves there and goes on into Egypt. So there's one example of an ancient migration. There's some more in the Bible that actually are available that you can read about. Joseph leaves Canaan and goes to Egypt. He is sold as a slave into Egypt. Jacob's sons, because there is a famine in Canaan, go to Egypt. And if you know the story of Joseph and the multicolored coat and how his brothers sold him into slavery, and then he was able to be used by God to actually save the land of Egypt from their famine. Moses, he actually gets the people out of Egypt and returns them to Canaan after they had been in slavery for many years under the leadership of Pharaoh. And then in the New Testament, we have Joseph, who is Mary's husband. Joseph and Mary were actually traveling from Nazareth to Bethlehem. They went from Bethlehem to Egypt and all the way back from Egypt to Nazareth when Jesus was a small boy. Here are some, like I said on the last slide, I would show you this. This is Moses' journey out of Egypt. And of course, the Israelites, they traveled out of Egypt and they wandered in the desert for 40 years until they got to the promised land of Canaan. So interesting how Abraham had left Canaan to go to Egypt, and then the people of God went back to Canaan, back to their promised land. So I'd like you to take a minute and write down any ideas of other migrations in history, maybe not biblical history, But a migration doesn't have to be from one country to the other. I want you to also think of any time where people have migrated within a country. So internal migration, not just external migration, going from one country to the next. I'd like you to write down a couple of those examples. But think about a time when either people have been forced to leave an area or they have desired to leave an area to go to a better area. Take a moment and see if you can remember anything that you've learned in your history that would be an example of migration, of people moving from one place to another. Those are maybe historical ones, and we'll talk about some of those in class and get some of your ideas. If you weren't able to find any, just leave some space. But people are still on the move today. People move for certain reasons. We're going to talk about those reasons in just a moment. But about anywhere from 2 to 4 million people each year move into another country. They migrate out of one country and into another one. The movement of people, if you would write this down, is migration. This is a formal definition of migration, the movement of people, very simple. And again, we can have internal migration, moving within a country or within a state, and then external migration, where you have people moving from one country and moving into another one. So here are some additional things that you can add to your definition. Migration is the movement of people across a boundary for the purpose of establishing a new or semi-permanent residence. So some people move to find somewhere to live permanently. Some people move maybe just for a time so they can work a job or they can help a sick family member. So there might be semi-permanent residence, or they may be moving for a completely new life and sense of adventure. Don't forget, migration is one more factor in measuring population increases. We said that the crude birth date and death rate, which we get the NIR, is one way to measure population increases, but migration can also be another factor and an indicator for an increase in population or a decrease in population. So why do people move? First of all, there could be push factors. So be very careful when you think about these, but a push factor is any negative force which would drive people away from a place. So when I give you these examples, I want you to be thinking about anything that's negative is a push out of a country. Examples: war, any other armed conflict. This could be a civil war. This could be a war that is being forced upon a country by another country. A famine or a drought. So famine is when there's no food that's being able to be grown. Drought goes along with that when there is no water. People might be leaving because there's no way to produce crops. Poverty. If there's an economic depression, a severe downturn in the economy, that might be a reason, a negative factor which would drive someone out of a place. A natural disaster. Think about this when I reflect upon Hurricane Katrina that happened in 2005 in New Orleans. A lot of people moved away from New Orleans from a time while their land was being rebuilt and cleaned up, and many of those people never moved back because they found new homes in different places. So that's a negative factor which pushed them out of their homes. Political corruption. Perhaps they are living in a country where the leadership does not have stability, where there is a dictatorship or corrupt forces. They would be moving out. Again, that's a negative force. And then religious intolerance. So I think about perhaps in 1620 when the Pilgrims left England and came over to the United States. There was religious intolerance of their religious values. People who are pushed by danger are often called refugees. A refugee is one who flees in search of a refuge, as in times of war, political oppression, or religious persecution. Refugees are definitely in the news today. We see a lot of them fleeing in Syria, some other parts of the Middle East. We also know that there are refugees who are seeking asylum and safety in America. They are coming from Latin American countries, Mexico. They are fleeing and seeking some kind of refuge in a new country. This is just an example of refugees that have been displaced. If you look up the HCR, it's an organization that takes care of housing for people. And again, these are numbers that have shown changes within borders over time. So again, the bigger the number is the number of refugees going into that country. Here's another example, again from the Humanitarian Information Unit, the HIU. It's from the Department of the United States Statistics. They have shown displacement of Syrian refugees. So if you look through, if there's a triangle, this is where refugee camps had been. So here's Syria here. A lot of the refugee camps had been placed along the border in Turkey, etc. Some in Iraq here, down here in Jordan. So these were camps that were set up. And then other accommodations like in Lebanon, these were places that people could go to seek refuge. And again, the Syrian refugee crisis began around the year 2011 when the civil war was taking place. The leadership in Syria was actually punishing anyone who was standing up against the government by attacking them through chemical warfare, biological warfare. Many people were killed. Many of their own people were killed because the government did not like the opposition that they were facing. In the 70s and 80s, especially after the Vietnam War, a lot of people began to leave Vietnam. They're referred to often as boat people. They crossed the Pacific Ocean. Many of them came as small children. Families did not want the children having to grow up in Vietnam, so they put them on these boats and sent them across the Pacific Ocean to the United States. And as I've mentioned before, Westminster, California is one of the largest homes to the Vietnamese population outside of Vietnam. So you'll see a lot of the culture from Vietnam in Westminster and in Garden Grove in California. Ethnic Albanians were sent to flee from their corrupt government. Here are some refugees from Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is an African nation. Cubans fleeing Castro in the 1950s and 60s. Fidel Castro became a communist dictator in Cuba. Many of those Cubans fled, and just until recently, he's been the leader there. He's a little bit older now and has gotten into poor health, but he has many of the people were fleeing because of the communist regime there. And Chad is another country in Africa. Interestingly enough, the global refugee population did drop from 9.5 million to 8.4 million in recent years because there was a return of people going back to Afghanistan. So during the Afghan war, from in the early 2000s, a lot of people were fleeing from the Taliban and the corrupt Taliban leadership in Afghanistan, but many of them returned when the Taliban was defeated. So this is just a kind of a visual. Anything in blue is a positive migration, so people going into a country. Anything negative is where people are leaving. Green would be a neutral. So you see a lot of people are fleeing from these Asian countries, either going north or into Western Europe. A lot of people in Eastern Europe are going into Western Europe. People from Latin America fleeing into North America. And then there are positive factors. So those are all negative factors, the push factors that actually force someone to leave a country. But there are also some pull factors. A pull factor is the positive force which draws people to a new place and doesn't necessarily have to have anything negative involved. It could just be that there's better opportunity somewhere. So here are a few of them. Again, a greater political stability, better availability of employment, better weather, better medical facilities, better education, maybe a family reason. Maybe someone has already moved. I know I have a lot of friends that live in California or that lived in California when I grew up. They have recently moved to areas like Tennessee and Texas, and their families have followed them there in probably the last 5 years. And then religious tolerance. So some of these are opposite of the push factors, but again, notice that some of these are just better, right? It's not that anything was negative in the place that they were living, but they wanted something that was more stable, something just a little bit better quality.